Williams came to West Norfolk in 1905, very beginning of 1905. Just to put it in context of where he was in his collecting career at that time, he, along with Cecil Sharp, was convinced that every village was a nest of singing birds. Sadly, some of them seem to have been shot. And that swift action was needed to capture this tradition before it disappeared, as you've already heard. He was no fan of the Victorian ballad. He said that the traditional songs were being swept aside by cheap and nasty verse allied to cheaper and nastier music. He didn't like Victorian parlour ballads. And he did have, as we've heard, some connections with East Anglia because of studying at Cambridge and because his Darwin cousins lived in Cambridge. And so we know that when he was there, he used to cycle to Ely and go to listen to music in the cathedral there. By 1905, he was 15 months into his collecting career. He'd been to Surrey, Sussex, Essex, London, Wiltshire, Yorkshire, and Kent. And he knew what he was doing by then. And as somebody said earlier, he was a charmer. I think he was a really good collector for that very reason. I think he could charm songs out of people where others failed and are known to have failed, particularly in Essex, actually. And by the end of the year, he was, 1904 this is, he was planning the next expedition. And a week after New Year, less than a week after New Year, he lands up in King's Lynn. He catches the train up to King's Lynn. He checks into the Cousins Temperance Hotel, which is just round the corner from the station. And he knew what he was up to. And why did he come? Well, we don't really know. He certainly wasn't expecting to collect in King's Lynn itself. He headed west into the fen villages, where on the first day he met John Whitby, the sexton at Tilney All Saints. And he had a note as well which said Bailey Hillan's Yard, which Liz will tell you a lot more about. He enters the picture much later. He wasn't in the fens. But maybe, we think, Mr. Whitby responded to a letter that he'd written to the Morning Post when somebody had complained that there were no folk songs in Essex. And he said that he was willing to write down the songs if people didn't feel they could do them themselves. And so maybe Mr. Whitby said, well, I know about some songs. And he went, we don't know. But let me hand to Liz, who will tell you about the Tilneys.
Can I have the next slide? As Jill said, John Whitby was the sexton of Tilney All Saints Church, which you've got in this picture. He didn't actually live in Tilney. He lived a few miles away at Walpole St Andrew. But I would guess that a lot of people in the Tilneys, and there are two Tilneys, would have known him. I suspect he aired his songs quite a bit. I've always liked Mr. Whitby's selection of songs because if you take them almost as a sample on their own, they're almost a sampler of quite a wide spread of English folk music. They include a couple of really old ballads, Lord Lovell and Lord Bateman. There's a Unfortunate Rake song. There's the Maria Martin, which I suppose is what Mr. Whitby has become most famous for, really. And it was a really nice selection of songs. I'm emphasising that point because of what comes later. And I would guess that it was Mr. Whitby who introduced Vaughan Williams to the other contact in the Tilneys, which was a farm labourer called Stephen Poll. And Stephen was an instrumentalist. He played the fiddle. Played the fiddle? Am I right with the fiddle? Yep. I'm going to let Jill talk about Mr. Poll because he is an instrumentalist and I am not. But he did throw in a song for good measure as well called The Fox Hunt.
Well, I like Mr. Poll because he was a fiddle player and I am. Vaughan Williams notes that the 4 tunes that he collected off him, he would play at village dances, and when the couples got to the top of the dance, then they would give him a penny. If you were on a farm labourer's wages, that would make a difference and be quite an incentive, I think. But also it's really interesting how he learnt those songs and the dances. It says he would go to Lynn Fair. Now, every year you may know that in King's Lynn there is a King's Lynn Mart. It's a big fun fair still. It starts on St Valentine's Day, has a huge grand opening still. And so whether he went to the Mart and learned the tunes at the dances, or whether it was a fair, there was a fair later in the year as well. So it might have been that he went to the later fair, which is much later in the year. But it says that he would dance at the bottom, if it was a new dance, he'd dance at the bottom of the set, which if you're a dancer, you'll know is the where you have the least to do and you can see what happens. Then he'd ask for it again later in the evening, and he'd dance the top of the set, where you're leading the set, and then he would go home. Now, Tilney is, well, if he was in Tilney or whether he was in Walpole, it's quite a distance.
7 miles?
Yeah, so if he walked or whether he cycled or whether he had a pony and cart, I don't know, but he must have had those tunes going round the back of his head, and he must have had the dances under his feet. How many of us, I ask, could actually remember a dance and a tune from 2 hearings on one night when you heard all sorts of other things as well? I mean, I always find one tune wipes out the one I've just heard. So interesting that he has such a good memory for it. The versions of the tunes, the Triumph, Gypsies in the Wood, the Low Back Car, and I always forget the other one. Anyway, they're fairly well known, but they're slightly different, you know, just odd bits and pieces different from the accepted versions. And probably that's why I would have said that as he went home, he didn't entirely remember them note for note. Interestingly, though, when he'd been to the Tilneys, he picks up 10 songs from Mr. Whitby. He gets this song, The Fox Hunt and the 4 Tunes from Mr. Pole. But he says in a lecture a few years later, he was about to leave the district in despair. This is 2 days' work, but then a chance meeting on the Tuesday marketplace in King's Lynn, the biggest marketplace in King's Lynn, changes all that.
Can I have the next slide? That's the piece of paper. I don't want to dwell on that because we're a bit tight for time. But on the right-hand column, the second line down is Bailey, and you'll notice it's spelt rather strangely, Bayley. The big Bailey family in Lynn spelt their name as you would probably automatically expect it to be, Bailey. But when he meets the singer, Mr. Bailey, he records him as Bayley. And I think this is Vaughan Williams' actually, because I don't think Mr. Bailey would have spelt it that way, because I don't think Mr. Bailey was literate. He signed his marriage register with a mark. We'll come to him later, but can I have the next one? Seated on the left, on your right, is the chance meeting. This is the Reverend Alfred Huddle, curate of St. Nicholas Chapel. St. Nicholas Chapel, which is redundant now, was never independent of the parish church, but it always had its own curate, who really fulfilled the functions of a vicar, and that would have been who the North Enders, who around the chapel, the fishing community, would have recognised as their priest. He wasn't a usual run of clergyman. He came from a working class background, which was very unusual at that time, and he had actually been a saddler in his time. And I think this perhaps made him very approachable to his community. And this is who Vaughan Williams met by chance. And he said, would he like to come and hear the fishermen sing? And with Reverend Huddle are the first two fishermen that he took Vaughan Williams to meet. He knew them particularly well because he had actually confirmed them as elderly men, Dougie Carter standing at the back. Vaughan Williams thought was about 70. He wasn't actually as old as that, but he was probably quite weather-beaten. And the other one, the bearded gentleman, is Joe Anderson. I don't think we've actually got a spot for Joe down here, so I'm just going to say that he sang 12 songs. A lot of the other singers I've found connections between, but not Joe, except for his friendship with Dougie Carter. But in the 1860s, he was keeping a pub called The Black Joke, and I just have a feeling that maybe that's part of the story as well, if only we knew. Can I have the next? This is where they all lived. Now, you've got a picture on your front of your programme, which is actually Pilot Street. Can you hold that while I...
Yeah.
I'm going to have to shout for a minute. Pilot Street goes across the top here, and that's actually the main artery of the North End. What you've got there is a picture of this. It's the sole remaining bit of the North End. The rest has been completely flattened in the 1960s. This is North Street, and this is where all the North End singers, with the exception of one, live. And you'll see houses facing onto the street, and then behind are these yards full of houses. I'm not going to go through it bit by bit. There's Joe's part, Black Joe. But Joe Carter is living here in Watson's Yard, and Joe Anderson is here in Churchill's Yard, so they're quite close. But you'll notice all the others are all around this small area. That's me done, because Jill is going to tell you about three of Mr. Carter's songs, and so I'm going to hand the microphone back to her.
Right, well, I'm not going to do all the songs. He collected 78 in all in King's Lynn, and I'm sure you want to be at work tomorrow, or at home at least. So, the first one, if I could have the next slide, this is Captain Ward, the pirate. And it's a really interesting song, because it's actually about 250 years old at that point, let alone now. And as you see, he's quite some figure. But it's based in fact. He was born in Faversham in Kent. He worked as a fisherman. Then he went into the Royal Navy. But then he went into the Mediterranean as a professional pirate, and he had 500 men at his command. And apparently he died of plague in Tunis in 1622. But his exploits were excellent material for the ballad writers. We've heard about broadside ballads. There's nothing they like just better than a bit of adventure or a bloodthirsty murder or something. It's a bit like the Sun these days. And he apparently got into this fight with a ship called the Rainbow, although the late Roy Palmer couldn't find a proper record of the fight with the Rainbow, couldn't find the Rainbow. But Dougie Carter included a voice from, Dougie Carter sang it. Vaughan Williams noted the words on this particular song. He included a verse from Mr. Bailey that we've been talking about. And the note is that Bailey describes this as the master song, and he says he won a silver watch from a Cheap Jack singing match for singing it. Now, Vaughan Williams goes on to use it quite a bit later, and clearly he agrees with Mr. Bailey. It is a master song because he really likes it. So that's one. The second I'm going to talk about, sorry, too near the speaker, the Captain's Apprentice. Now, I'm very diffident about saying this because Liz is the person who is the authority on the Captain's Apprentice and its background, so I always feel nervous about this, but he did note the words in full, and it was a knockout song. It has a wild and sort of Norse air to it, he thought, and it is an extraordinary song. he used it a lot, and he used the figures from it a lot. It became part of his musical language, and you listen to many of his works and you can hear the runs of The Captain's Apprentice in it. It's a really interesting song. It's also very savage. When he published it in the journal, he cut out the worst of the savage bits. It's about a boy being beaten to death, basically, by a cruel captain. Not an unusual sort of scenario for several years before this song was collected. It turns up elsewhere. The interesting thing is, one person says that he's beating him with a marlin, or a marlin spike, which is the thing you use for when you're splicing rope. You need a marlin spike to separate the twists of the rope. I think Mr. Bailey had him as a gasket, which is a rope. It's the gasket you wind round and round if you're in a sailing ship. So, which we don't know. Noting that St James's Workhouse is the local union, so he's got out of the workhouse. I think, though, quite a few workhouses were dedicated to St James. I don't know why. In King's Lynn, there was this case of the mistreatment of a boy called Robert Eastick, when the captain, Johnson William Doyle, was tried for cruelty. But there are previous broadside ballads of the same sort of story. So maybe it's just that people in King's Lynn picked it up because they thought, oh, we've heard this before. The only other song I'm going to mention very briefly is The Blacksmith, because nobody can find a reference to it anywhere else. And therefore, the thought is Mr. Carter made it up. Good folk processes, I would suggest. Roy Palmer, who's an indefatigable researcher on the subject of Vaughan Williams collections, said he'd never seen the song anywhere else, and I have to say, neither had I. Your turn.
Can I have the next slide? This is the present-day workhouse. It did take on the name St James's, but the original St James's workhouse collapsed in 1854, killing one inmate and the man who was going up to find out why the clock had stopped. And fortunately, some of them, I think, were away at church, and some had heard funny noises in the building and had got out into the open air. So this was its replacement, and this is where, quite early in his visit, that Vaughan Williams went to hear a completely different band of singers, and I wouldn't mind betting that his clerical contact perhaps facilitated, or at least helped get him entry into the workhouse. There are 7 singers in the workhouse. None of them are fishermen, but 4 of them are ex-sailors, and there's quite a few songs in the workhouse bit of the collection that are connected with the sea, one way or another. There seems to be quite a liking for ships that sink. But in addition to that, there was a Mr. West who was had been a soldier, and Mr. Cooper had been a shoemaker, and Mr. Elmer had been a labourer and possibly involved in digging the docks out. We don't know. So again, it was quite a spread. So again, we've picked out just a few of the, I think we might have just picked out 2, actually, haven't we, out of the workhouse songs.
So if you could give me the next slide. This is one of the illustrations that my sister has done for the book. She's an artist in King's Lynn. It's a 98, in other words, a ship of 98 guns, the sort of ship that Nelson would have been familiar with. Remember, in King's Lynn, we're talking about Nelson country. He knew the town very well. And this one is actually the Royal George, and Vaughan Williams certainly liked this tune, and it's called On Board a 98. It is a 98. And Mr. Leatherday, John Leatherday, sang it. It starts, when I was young and scarce 18, I drove a roaring trade. I love the words of these songs. And although Vaughan Williams didn't note the words, he did use the tune in his first Norfolk Rhapsody. So it made an impression on him. The Yorkshire collector, Frank Kidson, adds that the words are on a ballad sheet printed by Anne Ryle, who was the sister of one of the big broadside publishers in London. And during a talk on the BBC, and this is one of the things that I really like, during the Second World War in 1940, he wrote a talk for the BBC about a little suite of march tunes that he put together for the BBC's military band. And the third tune he used was this one, On Board a 98. And he said, this was sung to me in King's Lynn by an old sailor. I spent many happy mornings with him and his friends, listening to their almost inexhaustible stock of splendid tunes. These were the visits to the King's Lynn Union, and he made several during that week of collecting. Oh,
I think you've got...
Yes, and I've got the Cumberland's Crew. Next slide, please. This is another... I'm sorry, I like to see songs, something to do with the family background. This is the Cumberland's Crew, and it was sung by a man called Mr. Crisp, although it looks like Christ in Vaughan Williams' appalling writing, but we think he is Mr. Crisp. And the Cumberland it is actually a real battle, but it didn't happen here. It happened in America. It was part of the American Civil War. And it's all about, well, in the words of the song, it says, let each British tar drop a sad tear of pity when he thinks on the once gallant Cumberland's fate. Interesting thing is, of course, the Cumberland was an American ship. And this is the Battle of Hampton Roads. It took place during the Civil War in 1862, and a Confederate frigate called the Virginia, which had the advantages both of being under steam and was ironclad, not usual at that time, sank two Federal vessels, the frigate Congress and the sloop Cumberland. And this is the picture of it at the time. There she is, hitting the Cumberland, and she's about to sink, as you see. And she went on to beat 4 other ships that day and demonstrated how vulnerable wooden ships were when they were attacked by these new ironclad ships. And for some reason, Mr. Crisp makes it into a British ship, but she certainly wasn't, I'm afraid. She was American. She did sink with all hands aboard. And one of the interesting things about it is that she nailed her colours to the mast. In other words, they decided they would fight to the death before they began, because you couldn't strike your colours, which is the sign of surrender. So they'd already decided, and they went down apparently with all guns blazing and were complimented by the victors for their bravery and the strength with which they had tackled it.
Well, now for something completely different, because the next people to enter the story are the 3 women singers. Can I have the next slide? The first was Betty Howard, and Betty was a really very elderly lady. I think she was even older than Vaughan Williams thought she was, although she used to give rather different ages to the census man. They varied. You add it, well, 10 years later, she'll be 10 years older. No, she's only 5 years older. She had raised 12 children and brought them all to adulthood, and that takes a bit of doing at that time in that time and age. She sang 3 songs. One of them, the Sheffield Apprentice, has put his head in at the door several times already this morning, but that was one that she sang. But also, she sang one of the few work songs that were in the collection, a song with a chorus called Homeward Bound, which is why you're looking at Anne's picture of a ship. And also another rather gutsy song for a woman, the Waterfront Encounter. It's actually found its way. It's one that Vaughan Williams and Bert Lloyd put into the Penguin Book of English Folk Songs at Ratcliffe Highway. And it's one of the versions where he does actually get away the sailor gets away fairly unscathed. So quite a... I often wonder if these are songs that her big strapping fisherman sons sang, and she picked them up from them. Go to the next slide. And this is one where we can actually show you the singer. This is Mrs. Benifer. He'd recorded what he thought he heard as Mrs. Lally Benifer. Her nickname was actually Lolly. Her name was Harriet, but she was known as Loll. She too had some 12 children. And her songs, she only sang two. She sang Barbary Allen and a song called The Farmer's Daughter or The Banks of Sweet Dundee. Every verse ends up The Banks of Sweet Dundee. And by the end of it, the banks of Sweet Dundee are littered with people who've been slaughtered. But she looks like she might have enjoyed that sort of song. But if I can have the next slide, this is the diagram I did of the links between some of the singers. Now, Lol is a yellow square right in the middle. Below her, though, you move into the next generation because her son Tom and her son-in-law, Bustle Smith, are among people who sang when the BBC came round in 1955. So you've got two generations of singers there. And also, almost directly above her is her uncle, who's the John Bailey, who has been mentioned occasionally. He, I have to say, is a bit of a favourite of mine. He only sang one song, but he is recorded as, or let me put it another way, Vaughan Williams only wrote down one of his songs. He did sing others, and some of those, interestingly, were songs that were picked up from other people close by. At least Ward the Pirate, as Jill mentioned, he'd sung that, although it was collected from Dougie Carter, Captain's Apprentice. And I think he sang The Blacksmith as well. I'm sure we've got that on the list as well. It is likely, I'm pretty sure that he is the source of the one picture we have of Vaughan Williams actually collecting in Lynn from someone's house. We don't know the name of the singer that he visited, but John fits the bill better than any of the others. Somebody, I think Sue mentioned the time it takes to write a song down. And according to this story, Vaughan Williams turned up on the doorstep and persuaded Dad to sing one of the old songs. Just before he turned up, they'd put the dumplings on to boil. And the punchline of the story was that by the time he left, the dumplings had been boiling an hour and a half. So that's the only glimpse we have of him actually at work, which is quite precious. I think I've covered them, and I've done. Yes, I'm not going to go through all the connections because we don't have time. But the yellow blocks are the singers, and the pale blue blocks are people who are kind of part of the story who connect them up. And then next day, something completely different.
Off he goes to Sheringham.
We can do that.
We can do that. This is one of the families that he meets in Sheringham, or a member of the family. But the first person he meets is a man called Mr. Jackson. He's the gate crossing keeper. So I think he probably went by train. In those days, you could go from King's Lynn to Sheringham by train. Sadly, no more. And why he lands up in Sheringham, we don't exactly know. Again, could be that Kate Lee, who was Lucy Broadwood's predecessor as the secretary of the Folk Song Society, apparently had been told when she went to Wells and bravely walked up to a group of fishermen and said, "Do you sing any songs?" And they said, "Oh, no, you ought to go to Sheringham really to hear some decent songs." And she said, "Well, don't you sing while you're working?" And they said, "Oh, yes, but not songs as you'd like to hear." I wonder what they were. Anyway, he lands up in Sheringham. He meets Mr. Jackson, who had a sad beginning. He injured as a child, but he works for the railway, which was then extending in Sheringham. And then he walks down the high street towards the sea, and he goes in the Crown. And in The Crown, he meets this man, the one on the extreme left, whose name is Robert Emery. Now, this is a family of boat builders, and they built boats right up to the 1970s. And their famous one is one of the Sheringham lifeboats. But anyway, he apparently, the founder of the company was a man called Lewis, I've lost it, Emery. I was looking at Jackson. He was Lewis Emery. They called him Buffalo Emery because apparently on one occasion he carried a huge, heavy metal winch all the way up the beach on his back. So that gave him the nickname for life. And when he gave up, it was Robert who took over the company. Now, the boat building shed is one side of Lifeboat Plain in Sheringham, and the pub, the Crown, is the other side. And apparently he spent a great deal more time and money in the pub than he did in the boat building shed. And when he was in his cups, we're indebted here to Mike Emery, his great-grandson. Apparently he liked a bit of attention. He would jump on the table and he would sing. He was known in Sheringham for singing Kelly from the Isle of Man, but that hadn't been composed when Vaughan Williams turned up, so he sang him near Scarborough Town. So it was an interesting trip, only 2 songs, but it was a day out of quite a pressured week that he'd spent. There are all sorts of speculation you can do about why he goes to Sheringham, but it was an interesting visit. And if you go to Sheringham, you will see on the front there's a tile decoration about the Emery family, and Poppyland Publishing, who published our book, have done a book about the Emery family because they are an interesting Sheringham family.
Right, coming up to the end, the last weekend, he was now at the weekend, tacked onto his week. Back in Lynn, he visited Carter and Anderson again, and he picked up his last 3 singers. Mr. Smith the Sailor, cautionary tale here, because I didn't find Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith the Sailor is not a particularly easy description to track somebody down from. But the reason I had missed him quite clearly in the census of 1901 was simply because we'd believed all the singers were elderly men and women. And Edward Smith was only 28, and he was in the Royal Navy. It was just sheer chance that he was at home when the census was taken in 1901, and he was at home visiting his mum in January 1905. He only produced 1 song. How they met, we don't know. Next slide. And then there was the sailmaker, the North Lynn inhabitant who was not a fisherman, although he had been a sailor in his time. He was a very important person, though, to the fishermen. As you can see, he was a sailmaker. He actually produced a lot of songs. And then the last one was a Mr. Harper, and I think we've got Watson's Yard next, haven't we? Yes. It's surprising he hadn't visited Mr. Harper before, because he was Dougie Carter's cousin, and not only that, they lived in the same yard, and this is Watson's Yard, where they both lived. Characterised, like most of the yards, very small houses. The shadowy building on the right is the facilities and the washing. And Mr. Harper actually sang him quite a considerable number of songs. I can't explain why he wasn't visited before, but there must have been a reason. And I would guess, curiously, that when on last day he and Mr. Carter sang to Vaughan Williams together, they were probably round at Mr. Harper's, because the interesting thing is, in 1976, I spoke to Dougie Carter's daughter and adopted daughter. They remembered him singing. They remembered there being singing sometimes on a Sunday night. They remembered him singing a song which he's certainly not known as having sung. He sang The Dark-Eyed Sailor. He also sang something else because his daughter quoted a couple of lines that don't fit in that song. They fit in another one. And yet they had no memory whatsoever of him having sung to anybody collecting songs. So I'm guessing that possibly the first time he perhaps was round at Joe's in Churchman's Yard, and the second time perhaps round at his cousin William Harper's. But that is a quick resume of all our different our singers from King's Lynn. Do buy a copy of the book if you want to know more. And I think we've got one closing slide.
The interesting thing about this visit to King's Lynn is the impact it made. Because just as Bushes and Briars and his first visits in Essex made a huge impression, so did this one, more so, as far as you can make out, than most of the others that he made. Because he, on the last day, he writes to his cousin and says, I'm collecting the most wonderful songs from the fishermen here. A fortnight after he gets back to London, he goes, Lucy Broadwood had a cold, she was always getting a cold, she had a cold, but by the time she gets over it, she entertains Rafe and Adeline to tea, and he plays the piano and he plays the songs that he's picked up, and he says, and she says, he is writing a symphony from the songs of his collecting. So it clearly made a big impression, and he was quick to say, you know, how important this week had been. And as we know, he was going to do a Norfolk Symphony. It landed up as 3 fantasias, rhapsodies, beg your pardon. And although 2 were lost, he suppressed them basically. Number 1 was published, but not until 1925. Wasn't published immediately, even though it was premiered at the Proms with Sir Henry Wood conducting. So just to finish, let me quote Roy Palmer, who has done so much work on this. And he says, Vaughan Williams is a composer of the first rank who owes a great deal to folk song, but folk song owes a great deal to him. The predominant feeling should be of immense gratitude that he should have made his collection at all, and beyond that, to have spent so much time annotating, arranging and promoting folk songs. We are deeply indebted to him. Now in King's Lynn, we are doubly indebted to him because he handed to us a living memorial of a lost fishing community, as Liz said, wiped out in the slum clearances of the 30s and the 50s. And it's a window onto the lives of those men and women who sang to him their almost inexhaustible stock of splendid tunes.